series. We're in week 8 now of this Hear and See series. In 6 of those weeks, we looked at Jesus' parables, those stories that provoked us to think and to reflect on our own hearts. Now we're in week 2 looking at his miracles. Last week, we started off with the Jesus turning water into wine and saw how God revealed his goodness and his glory there. Now we're going to go a little bit later in his ministry, another very famous story that many people will be familiar with, the feeding of the 5,000 plus, as I call it, and hopefully you'll see why I put that plus in there. So this is Matthew 14:13 through 21. You can open up a Bible on the table about 3/4 of the way through. You can read it behind me. You can pull up a link at the bottom of your bulletin on your smartphone or device and read along with me. All right, this is Matthew 14:13 through 21. I'll read it and then we'll get started. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But the crowds heard it. They followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Now when it was over, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They said to him, "We have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish." He said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves, gave them to the disciples. The disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the word of the Lord. Well, as long as humans have existed, as far as we can tell by human history, one of the things that people have been up to, one of the things that is true, is that we have been making temples to various gods and spiritual ways of life that people follow. We have a tendency as people, no matter what faith you look at, to make extravagant buildings in honor of the gods that we worship or follow, or if there's Eastern spirituality where it tends to be less focused on deity and might be more metaphysical. There are temples. It's a universal in some sense. You go all the way back to even to ancient Egypt, and you look at the ancient Mayans and Aztecs and things. There are temples that have something to do with the spiritual way of life that are glorious, and there's grandeur and there's splendor. Here are some 3 modern ones I'll put up behind me from various backgrounds and faiths. And then, of course, the one up in the upper left corner is an ancient Greek one as well, but all having to do with different ways that we try to approach God, or different places that are glorious, that have some sort of beauty and are supposed to lead us into a spiritual place, many of them say. And what happens, the grandeur, the beauty, the kind of glorious temple aspect and the decorations and things continues usually as you move inside these various temples. So I've got a couple examples of different places inside that are religious institutions. You see the very famous Sistine Chapel, of course, is absolutely gorgeous and beautiful inside. There's another huge decorated cathedral on the bottom. On the upper left is a picture I took at the local temple here in Chinatown. And I had a chance to go there for a project that I was doing, and went to step in, and there's incense burning, but it was just absolutely gorgeous and beautiful in there. But when you look at these places, outside and inside, they communicate something special, right? There is something significant going on is what they are communicating to us. And sometimes what they're communicating is that this is a holy place, because you are potentially approaching a holy God or a set-apart gods. What's not communicated is that these are average places, that these are mundane locations. Sadly, what can happen sometimes from places like this is that no matter your religious persuasion, they can leave people with the impression that because these places are special, holy, extravagant, glorious, that then we ourselves must be special to approach them. We ourselves must be clean. We ourselves must be holy. We ourselves cannot come just as we are, that we must change in order to fit these places before we come. And more importantly, what we can sometimes have communicate to us is that we need to change ourselves before we come to these gods. And even in ancient Israel, if you remember, as we went through the Old Testament series, the Jewish scriptures, we looked at the temple. They had a temple, and it was glorious and grand inside as well. Sometimes these places, no matter what religious persuasion or spiritual persuasion they are, can give the impression that your needs are not met by this God unless you come to him or her correctly. The image of Jesus at the feeding of the 5,000 plus shows us a God who is completely different than getting that impression from those temples and cathedrals. This story shows us a God who comes to us instead of requiring us to go to him. A God who has time for us any time of the day. A God who comes to us in the mundane and the average, not the special and the glorious and the extravagant. And a God who meets our needs not on our terms, not on only his terms and his schedule, not when we measure up, but absolutely what we truly need. And then he satisfies us completely. So let's see the details of this story and how it kind of works out so you and I can both get that picture. First, we'll see the story of the feeding of the 5,000, the miracle of the feeding, shows us the God who has time. As we begin to look at this miracle, it's important to realize a few things. We always got to realize what context, unless we're kind of continuing on the exact same passage and section and chapter every week, we're kind of jumping around. So we got to kind of get the context and always realize what is happening. This miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, is the only miracle outside of the resurrection that takes place in all four biographies of Jesus, all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Meaning, in some sense, this was extremely important to the early church. This was extremely important to the apostles in terms of what it communicated about Jesus, because otherwise, why would all four of them tell it in different ways and from their own perspectives unless it really mattered? Second, the other Gospels actually kind of help add in some details if you're just looking at one of these perspectives. So we're looking at Matthew, of course, but John tells us that this was around the time of Passover. So when we look at the time frame of Jesus' ministry, he did ministry for about only 3 years while he was on earth. So this being around the time of Passover and where this is in Matthew means this was about a year before Jesus would enter Jerusalem, go die on the cross, and rise from the dead. So Jesus has all 12 of his disciples with him at this point. He has done tons of miracles up to this point. Not everyone will look at, but lots of miracles. He's done lots of healings. He's done lots of teaching. So he's got some large crowds hanging out with him. This is opposite of what we saw last week, where Jesus was just beginning his ministry and he had very small groups. Now, big crowds. People are talking about him on talk radio. Things are going on. He's got people who have new podcasts. Who is this Jesus guy? And it's really popular. It's going on. Newscasts are talking about him. So that's what's going on here. And in just a couple chapters after this here in Matthew, Peter is going to make his famous confession saying that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the sent one of God. So the disciples at this point have seen some of Jesus' supernatural power. They're about ready to believe that he's more than just a mere prophet. So look with me at the beginning of the story. Matthew tells us that Jesus hears something that causes him to withdraw and go into a boat and try to get away. And what he hears, if you look at the story right before this, he hears of John the Baptist's beheading by King Herod. Herod was the Jewish king appointed by Rome, and for whatever reason, that causes Jesus to try to get away, to try to get into a boat, to go be alone and be by himself, probably with his disciples close by. And you see that there in verse 13. Now, we don't know if Jesus was getting away because Matthew doesn't really give us many details here, but if he was getting away because he saw John's execution as a threat to his own ministry, and he goes, it's not my time yet, I need to get away and kind of go reflect and make sure this doesn't happen to me, or it could be or he was getting away to mourn. Jesus and John the Baptist were cousins. They were close in a sense as family, and so Jesus might have been taken away and gone, this is extremely tough. I need to go have my own time to be alone. Or, Jesus might have just been a little more introverted at this point. I'm an introvert. Sometimes when I've been busy and I've been around lots of people, I'm like, I just got to get away. This is really tough. And especially if there's grief going on, I might feel that especially. So all those things could be going on in Jesus. We don't really know the reason. We're not really given the reason why he seeks to get away and be alone, but we know that is what he's trying to do. And Jesus, sometimes we forget about this, but he was fully human. So he has the same needs for getting alone, the same needs for community, the same needs for when he gets tired, he's got to rest and recuperate and sleep. He has the same needs. So some of those are probably going on here. But Matthew tells us somehow they got a little spy or someone's leaking things, but someone hears Jesus going over here. And so, or they can see him traveling on the boat where he's headed to, and all the crowds go, he's heading over there. And so they all start walking on foot to get to where he is going to be. And Matthew tells us they get there before he gets there. And Jesus shows up and he's trying to get alone. And all of a sudden, here's the huge crowd of people in the place where he was trying to get away. Now, imagine you're Jesus, okay? You're 2 years into your ministry. Crowds are all over the place all the time now. They're all looking for you to heal and their sicknesses and their illnesses and things. They're looking for your teaching. Your cousin, who has a similar divine role that you have, has just been beheaded by the governing leaders. You know the mission your Father God has given you, and that your own death at some point is coming in a similar horrible fashion, and you are just hoping to get away for a bit, possibly hoping to get away to pray, to focus on God and remember the calling that he was given, and you're just hoping to get away to grieve and to be by yourself. And then, as he's doing that, he comes up onto shore, and all the crowds are back waiting for him as he's trying to get away. Now, if that was me, it would be over, right? Be like, no, people go away. Death in the family. Let me have some time here. It's like for us, probably one of the closest things we could imagine or experience. Have you ever had, especially summertime now, you have some vacation coming up. You're looking forward to it. Maybe it's weeks out, and you're kind of at work or you're at home and you're daydreaming about, oh gosh, I just can't wait to get away on this vacation. I'm so tired. It'll be just so great to relax. And so you go on this vacation, you start it out, finally it's almost here. You take a long trip to wherever you're getting to, you have the hotel room, and as you get to open the door to your hotel room and you're about to go, finally, vacation, your boss calls on the phone and says, there's an emergency at work, you have to come back now. And you're like, right? Have you ever had an experience or something like that, or you can imagine what's going on? Jesus approaches, he's just trying to be alone in his time of mourning, and everyone is there waiting for them. So how does Jesus respond to the needy crowd? Thousands of people. Does he seem to give them a huge sigh? Verse 14, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. What do we learn from this amazing response from Jesus to the crowds when he was seeking to be alone? That Jesus is the God who has time for us. He does not see the needs of the crowd and go, I have no time for that right now. I'll get to it later. First, I need me time. Jesus, the God of the universe, need a little me time by myself, and then I'll go help everyone else out. Jesus is the God who sees our needs. And when he sees you, he's the God who sees your illnesses, who sees your difficulties, who sees your sadness, who sees your pain, who sees your weaknesses, and he doesn't sigh and say, I'll get to that later. That's too much right now. He's the God who has compassion on all those things. When God sees your continued struggles, when he sees the times you continue to mess up, when he sees and you show your weakness in new ways that you can't even imagine, he doesn't sigh at you. He responds with compassion to meet your needs. Isn't that good news? You know, in our time-oriented culture, we tend to be, in LA, in the West, tend to be very time-oriented. We oftentimes see it as understandable that we need to get things done. There are plans in our lives. We have busy lives. Sometimes it's common for us to say to other people in need, sorry, I can't help with that right now. I have X, Y, or Z coming up. The reaction of Jesus, in some sense here, especially when we are tired and in a hard situation, along with teaching us how he responds, should at least push us that sometimes me time is not a godly response to other people's needs. Sometimes we need to lay down our own concept of what is most important to help people that are in a time of need. That's the first thing we see from this story. Jesus is the God who has time for our needs. And now he's going to radically meet those needs and show that he's the God in the mundane. He is the God in the mundane. The day goes on. Jesus is out with these crowds in this new location, and he's apparently healing every disease and every illness that he comes in contact with. And from the numbers that get described later on, this was no small task. There are other accounts that describe Jesus as doing a lot of teaching here as well, but for whatever reason, Matthew decides to focus on the healing that he was doing in the crowd. But then something starts to happen, right? Tick, 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 tick. The day is getting later. Late afternoon comes on. And the disciples start going, okay, they're in charge of they're Jesus' entourage, and they're kind of in charge of moving along the ministry to the next location, next task. They start looking at their watches and going, 3 p.m., 4 p.m., 5. Jesus, these people are going to need to eat, and we are here in the middle of nowhere. And they start freaking out. It appears there's no village nearby. There's no town nearby. They're in a desolate place. There are thousands of people here, so it's a huge logistical nightmare. Maybe some of the disciples, there's 12 of them. You imagine some are a little more detail-oriented and are thinking, this isn't going to happen. Like, you don't understand. Jesus, you people need to eat. We need to get them out of here. And they're freaking out. Some of you who are more detail-oriented can think, thousands of people. Yeah, that would be a serious problem. Well, I'm freaking out thinking about it. So this time is going on. People are getting healed. Wonderful things are happening. And they're looking at their time going, Jesus, this is great that you're healing everyone. This is really wonderful. We love it. Happiness, yay, people getting healed. But these people need to eat now. There's kids. There's, women, pregnant mothers probably at some point. We need to get them some food. You got to wrap this up and get out of here. I imagine some of the disciples are absolutely freaking out. And what does Jesus say to them? Oh, you're right, guys. Thank you. Thank you. I lost track of time. Yeah, thank you for keeping me on top of my ministry schedule. Everyone, okay, make an announcement. Go into the towns. Here's you can go 5 miles down the road here, whatever. Jesus turns to them as they're freaking out and as they bring this up and says, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. I imagine, especially the detail-oriented disciples, probably going, oh, geez, really? Like, what is he saying now? Does he have some lesson we're supposed to learn from this? What is he talking about? Like, is there some miracle that's going to happen that we need to, be aware of? What does he mean we give him something to eat? They have seen enough of Jesus up to this point to get at least a hint of the truth that the God of the universe is standing before them. The one who they are stressing out about resources in front of is the one who makes the wheat that makes the bread. They have seen enough to know the one who stands before them is the one who gives fish life. And not only is he the one who gives bread and fish the chance to exist, he's created every person. He's created the whole universe and every star in the sky merely by speaking it. And he is the one standing before them now. And they're freaking out. They forget. Or maybe they still need to learn it or learn it again. How often, it's a humble time right now for DJ and for all of us, how often, if you're a follower of Jesus, do you look at your needs? Do you look at your problems? Do you look at the things around your life that seem impossible to you? Look at your work, look at your money, problems with your kids, problems with your significant other or spouse, and you can act like the disciples here, that the very God of the universe is not completely yours and completely in your corner. How often do you act like the disciples and say in your heart, no, Jesus, you don't understand. There are only 5 little loaves of bread and 2 fish and thousands of people. This can't be done. And Jesus kindly looks at us in the eyes and says to us, remember who I am, son. Remember who I am, daughter. I am yours. The disciples, apparently in the midst of Jesus telling them, you give them something, they start finding food in the crowd. They search, they find 5 loaves, 2 fish. John tells us this was a little boy's lunch that he had brought along with him, and he, for whatever reason, didn't eat it earlier. John tells us also it was a barley loaf. Loaves and fish at this time, barley loaf especially, were the food of the poor. It was the most common food you could have had if you lived around the Sea of Galilee. And so in the midst of his disciples freaking out, in the midst of them forgetting who he is, in the midst of them forgetting what they've seen him done, he takes the bread and the fish and he says, I'm going to take care of this. Now watch me show up. I'm so very thankful for this picture of Jesus that we have here. These people, in the midst of the disciples freaking out, they're not in a fancy place, right? They are not in Jerusalem, the most important city religiously, especially for Jews, in the world at this time. They're not at the temple, the most holy place where God's glory is most greatly revealed, right? The holiest of sights. They don't have the best food. They don't have filet mignon. They don't have lobster sitting there or gratin potatoes, whatever, roasted asparagus, whatever it is that would be food fit for a king. And not just a king, food fit for the king of the universe. God himself standing before them. We would expect, if buildings and extravagance are things we need to come before God, that we would not see God show up in a place like this. We build grand temples. We build great cathedrals. That's where God shows up. But not Jesus. He's the God of the mundane. What is more common than having a meal? You do it probably 3 times a day, maybe if you're American. Some places they do it, smaller meals, different times. We do it every single day, unless you're on a cleanse or something. I know, DJ, I'm on a 10-day cleanse, right now, and I don't eat, whatever. We do this regularly, right? A meal is a normal thing. What is more common than a poor boy's sack lunch that he brings with him? What's more common than a grassy hill next to the water out in the middle of nowhere? Is it too filthy for Jesus? Is it too common for Jesus? Not at all. Rather, this is where Jesus is going to do one of his most important miracles. He's going to show one of his most glorious acts in the most common of ways to the most common of people. Bread and fish. There are no lightning bolts coming out. Choo, choo, choo. Watch this, everyone. Pew, pew, pew. If bread comes out and, doing that. There's no grand stage that Jesus steps up upon and goes, listen, everyone, here I come. Glory will now come upon you all. It's very mundane, very average. There's no hype man that gets up on stage, right, in the middle and goes, standing 5 foot 8 inches tall, Jesus, the Lord of the universe. Here he comes. Sunday, Sunday, Sunday. Miracle. It's average. It's normal. Jesus simply says, bring it to me. Sit down on the grass. Get ready for me to show up. He very normally looks up to heaven, shares a common Jewish blessing, nothing flashy about it, and starts distributing the bread and the fish through the disciples. And glory shows up, right? Other gods require you to lift yourself up. Your morals, your character, your goodness, your holiness, to see if you can attain to God's level, to see if you can get up to his approval. Or more secular, non-spiritual versions, culture often puts pressure on us. You need to have the right politics if you're going to be accepted in certain areas of culture. You need to have the right looks, right? LA, we're very look, appearance conscious culture. You need to have the right social status. You need to have the right skin color if you can attain to our standard, if we'll accept you. Jesus is the God who comes. He sees all our failed attempts at our own morality. He sees all our own failed attempts at our own goodness and spirituality. He sees our failed attempts to measure up to others in society and to measure up to him or any other God that is out there, to the glorious temples and cathedrals that we build. And he comes to us in the most mundane way possible. So question for us, do we treat people the same way as he does? Are there standards people must attain before us, before we will accept them and treat them with God's love and kindness? Will we only meet people on our terms if we agree with them? That's not how Jesus treats us. There is no need, there is no fault, there is no ordinary aspect of someone, there is even no evil that we have done that will keep him from us. He is the God of the mundane. And the world today is filled with people who get along with other people who are just like them. Followers of Jesus are to be those people who love people even when they're not like us in any way. Because that's how Jesus loves us in the most simple way. Well, let's close by seeing that Jesus is the God who also overly satisfies us. Jesus not only is the God who has time for us when others do not. Jesus not only is the God who doesn't require us to clean ourselves up, to holy ourselves up, to get ourselves presentable before he comes, but comes to us in the most mundane, average setting so that everyone is welcome in his kingdom. But he's also the one that satisfies us completely and overly satisfies us as well. So, verse 20 and 21, you can look at it on the screen. Look at the results of Jesus' miracle. Every single person eats. Not just eats, but is satisfied, right? See that in verse 20. Not just that, they pick up 12 baskets full of leftovers, right? For later on, for a midnight snack or whatever. In the end, Matthew tells us 5,000 men were fed, among others. He adds that detail in, though, that says there were other women and children as well. Now, Matthew, if you remember from the times we've looked at him before, he's specifically writing his biography of Jesus or his gospel to a Jewish community. In the way, for better or worse, this seems patriarchal to us and very negative, but for better or worse, the way they counted back then was they just counted adult males. And so it's likely here, if you have problems with Matthew, I'll connect you guys in heaven. You can talk about his patriarchy later. But for whatever reason, he's using his own way to count. But he tells us that added detail. There were women and children there too. It is likely there were probably greater than 10,000 people there. This is why I say the feeding, it's commonly known as the feeding of the 5,000, but I say the feeding of the 5,000 plus because it's obvious there were others there. An incredible amount of people. The Staples Center fills about 19,000 people when it's sold out, so almost double this. But still, here's a conference we went to 2 years back now, I think, in Nashville. Went to Ascend Conference out there. That's about 10,000 people or so. That's the local hockey stadium there. Now, if you've been to a conference that's like that big at some time, where they do like lunches sometimes that are included in the conference package, there's an incredible amount of logistics, right, that have to go into which exits you go out to get the food, and whether it's Chick-fil-A boxes or whatever sack lunch and things that's given out. It takes a ton of volunteers to happen. It takes a ton of time to happen. It's a logistical headache, potentially, lots of planning. But here, Jesus just does it in the most simple way. There seems to be no flair, no effort. It just happens. You're kind of wondering, I wonder this anyway. It's like, is Jesus tearing it and it keeps going? Did the disciples do it too? It's probably happened in the disciples' hands as well, because there's such a great crowd. It's probably not all coming from Jesus, but as the disciples are breaking it, they're like, whoa, more bread, more fish. It just keeps coming out of my hands. So I don't know. We don't have any footage, obviously, of how it went down, but it was miraculous and simple in how it happened. Jesus taught us to pray, as we just prayed a bit ago, give us this day our daily bread. This miracle we see here, him providing bread and fish, him providing for the simple needs of 10,000 people. This story, in a sense, is a way for us to remember Jesus does this every single day in your life. Did you know that? He promises to provide for his children. If you're a follower of Jesus, he promises you will have all you need. You may not always feel like you have everything you need. He promises he will never let us go totally helpless. He knows what we need. He promises to provide for his children food, money, shelter. He knows every single need you and I have. And every single day, just like he does here, simple commands, and it happens. He does that every single day for you and for me. Every meal you eat, every time you put gas in your car, every time you write a check to pay your rent or online bill pay or whatever it might be, Jesus is commanding, just like he commanded the bread and the fish here, for you, because he loves you every single day. We so often, it's so easy, right, to believe we are the reasoning. It's primarily our financial planning, our work, our jobs. It is our selves that provide for us. It's hard to see. We don't see miracles necessarily going on. And all that stuff is true. This story is reminding us behind that, he is the one every single day ultimately making it happen. Which is why Christians say blessings before meals. We eat and we remember, thank you for providing this for us. But it would be easy. You could spend a lot of time reflecting on this passage and going, what are the ways I doubt God will provide for X, Y, or Z need? And that would be a good thing for you to spend some time doing. But there's something deeper going on here, right? There's something that if we didn't lift our eyes up to, we'd be missing the fullness of this story. How many baskets full did the disciples pick up afterwards? 12, right? We didn't spend, we spent a year and a half in the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, that's about a year ago now or so, about a half a year. We finished that out. We didn't spend as much time looking at this, but how many tribes of Israel were there or are there? 12. Same number, coincidentally, same number of disciples. So what is going on with there being 12 baskets full of food left over? Well, you see, the promises of the Old Testament, the promises of the Jewish scriptures of knowing God, of having God as your Father, are not merely that we'll be satisfied for a moment, but the promises of the Old and the New Testament are that when you know God, you will be overly fulfilled and satisfied. One of my absolute favorite verses is Psalm 16:11. I'll put it up behind me. This is David speaking of what it's like, what the promises of knowing God are like, and if they don't feel like that fully today, they will be someday. He says, "You, God, make known to me the path of life. In your presence, there's fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore." Overly satisfied. Fullness of joy, pleasures forevermore are the promises of knowing God. Most days, for myself, doesn't necessarily feel like that all the time, right? Not unless you are on a whole nother level. You probably don't wake up and go, "Life is beautiful, God loves me, and I'm just going to go radiate that love to everyone." Maybe you do. If you do, I need to hang out with you some more to remind me of what is true. But most days it doesn't always feel exactly like that, right? But there are times where we get glimpses of that, right? Maybe the heights of worship, the heights of your own study in the Bible, the best times with other people that you love and care for, potentially, but not always pleasures forevermore, fullness of joy necessarily. But it's a promise. If you know God and if you trust Jesus, you'll see it in part today and in fullness one day to come. With these 12 baskets, 12 most likely representing Israel, Jesus is essentially saying he is the one who will overly satisfy Israel, as is promised in the Old Testament, as is promised in Psalm 16:11. He is the one that will fulfill all those promises forevermore. He is the fulfiller of Psalm 16:11 for us. And there's one more momentous occasion, right? Where Jesus lifted up a mundane meal, very normal, average meal, to signify something much greater, right? We do it every week here at church, here at Anthology. Jesus lifted up the bread and he lifted up the cup of communion before he went to the cross and before he rose from the dead. And at communion, Jesus used the very mundane, normal wine and bread. And he says to us, this is what it cost me to come to you. This is what it cost me to provide you fullness of joy and pleasures forevermore. This is my promise that I will never, ever leave you empty, but will satisfy you forever. That's why we do it every week here. We need that reminder every single week that this is true. He will provide. He will be the one who truly satisfies us. So communion isn't the reminder that we provided to God our own goodness and morality. Communion isn't the reminder that I got myself good enough to enter this holy, holy place and sanctuary and glorious building that I'm in. Not that the rec center is glorious by any means here. But communion isn't the reminder that we got ourselves good enough to satisfy God. Communion is the reminder that God provided everything for us through the death and resurrection of his son, Jesus, so that he, not that we would satisfy him, but that he might satisfy us forever. And his work is so powerful that it not only flows to Israel and anyone in Israel that would choose to put their trust in him, but it overflows to anyone outside of Israel, to any of you and to me, to all that will eat from his cup and put their faith in him. Let's pray. Father, here we have a really short story about how you do something really incredible. And as I'm doing my own study this week, I'm blown away by how not flashy this is. How Matthew just kind of says, it just happened, multiplied. Glory shows up in the most unexpected places. I know I get caught in the trap of thinking my own performance, my own goodness, my own ability to trust you well or not trust you well determines how you will respond to me. And here you show up in a time when on earth you were trying to get away, trying to be alone, need some recuperation time, and you meet needs. You see us with compassion. You see our faults and you see our weaknesses. And you don't sigh, you don't get tired of us. But you come and you love us and you meet our needs and you remind us gently, remember who I am. Father, help us today to remember who you are, to remember the God of the universe is ours. And help us to remember the meal that you had at the end of your life, that we celebrate again today. That not only do you meet our temporary needs, not only do you meet our daily needs for food and sustenance, not only do you meet our needs for shelter and all the other average needs we have, you met our eternal needs through giving your life on the cross, your body and your blood, so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be reunited to you, so that we could be overly satisfied forevermore. Remind us of those things this morning, and as we celebrate communion, remind us that that truth is ours. Show us ways we doubt your provision. Help us to see the goodness that you are. In Jesus' name.